When Julia and Mark Talbot signed the papers for the two-story Spanish-style home in the Hollywood Hills, they knew only the broad strokes of its history. Built in the late 1920s, stucco walls the color of warm sand, red clay roof tiles that had weathered nearly a century. The listing had mentioned celebrity provenance, but the realtor's tone when glossing over it made it seem like a harmless selling point. The house was elegant, private, surrounded by palms, and at a price that felt suspiciously low for that neighborhood. It was too tempting to pass up. It wasn't until their second week in the house, unpacking boxes in the upstairs bedroom, that Julia found the name carved faintly into the inside of a closet door. C. The letters had been traced over so many times they were almost etched into the wood. She mentioned it to Mark, who shrugged. Probably some old tenant's initials, maybe even a set designer's prank. But Julia's curiosity was sharper. A few quick searches led her down a rabbit hole. This was the house where Cass Elliot, Mama Cass of the Mamas and the Papas, had lived. And more than that, this was the bedroom where she had died in 1974. At first, the connection was almost thrilling. Julia even started listening to the band's music while cooking. But as the nights grew hotter and the windows stayed open to let in the canyon breeze, a different atmosphere began to settle in. The first incident was small. The sound of someone humming, muffled but close, drifting from the hallway at nearly 2 a.m. Mark thought it was the neighbors, except the houses nearby weren't close enough for sound to travel like that. Not in the dead stillness of those hills. Then came the smell. Sweet, cloying, almost like a heavy perfume mixed with cigarettes and something faintly metallic. Julia would wake at night to find it hanging in the air, strongest in the upstairs bedroom. Mark, who wasn't as easily spooked, began to notice that their cat refused to go near the closet with the carved initials. It would stop at the doorway, tail puffed, eyes tracking something invisible. 3 weeks in, they hosted friends for wine on the patio. Mid-conversation, one guest stopped talking, her gaze fixed past Julia's shoulder toward the upstairs window. "Who's that?" she asked. Julia turned to see what she meant: just a shadow in the glass, shaped almost like a woman standing still. When they went upstairs to check, the room was empty, but the closet door was wide open. Neither of them remembered leaving it that way. Mark finally confessed that he'd been hearing music, soft, old, and distant whenever he was alone in the house. He'd find the radio in the kitchen turned on in the morning, even though they never used it. Julia admitted she'd been dreaming of a woman in a caftan, smiling but saying nothing, just standing at the foot of their bed. By the end of their first month, Julia was spending her nights downstairs, unable to sleep in the upstairs bedroom. Mark tried staying there alone once. He left the lights on until sunrise. The thing about that house, they later said, was that it wasn't aggressive. It didn't feel like whatever was there wanted to hurt them. But it was persistent. It made its presence known in ways that slowly wore down their nerves. A drawer left open, the faint weight of someone sitting on the bed, the low creak of the floorboards in the hallway as if a barefoot figure was pacing. Julia swore she once heard a whisper directly in her ear as she stood at the bathroom sink, "Don't change it." She didn't know what that meant, but it kept her from making any more decorating decisions upstairs. They lasted 6 months before quietly selling the property, never mentioning to the buyers the strange weight the house carried. The realtor didn't mention it either. Hollywood houses have long memories, and this one, no matter who held the keys, was still hers. Julia didn't like to admit it, but the moment they decided to sell the house, something in her resisted. Not because she wanted to stay, she couldn't bear another sleepless night in that upstairs bedroom, but because she felt as if the house had been watching, listening, and might not take kindly to their departure. She had begun to notice that certain things happened more often since they'd started talking about leaving. The humming had grown clearer, now unmistakably a woman's voice, low and velvety, drifting through the air as if carried on a warm wind from another time. Sometimes the notes were just fragments, as though the singer was testing her voice before a performance. Other times, the melody was so full that Julia found herself stopping mid-step, straining to hear the next line before realizing she was alone. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Julia decided to clean the upstairs closet, the one with the initials carved deep into the wood. She had avoided it for weeks, tossing things in quickly without lingering. But that day, Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, and for the first time in a while, she felt almost brave. The air inside was still and warm. The scent that had haunted her dreams, perfume and cigarettes, was concentrated here, as though the wood itself had absorbed it decades ago. She ran her fingers along the carving, tracing the C with her nail. The wood felt slightly warm to the touch, and her skin prickled, though the room itself was cool. At the very back of the closet, beneath a loose floorboard, she found something. A small, round, compact mirror with a floral pattern worn almost smooth. Inside, the glass was cracked, and the powder compartment was empty. But in that fractured reflection, for the briefest second, she thought she saw another face overlapping her own wide eyes, heavy lashes, lips moving silently as if trying to speak. She dropped the mirror, and it hit the wood with a sharp, ringing sound that seemed far too loud for the small space. When Mark came home that night, Julia didn't mention it. But she noticed that the humming returned after midnight, louder than before, accompanied by the soft creak of footsteps moving from the hallway toward their bedroom. Mark, who still tried to rationalize everything, grew quieter over the weeks. He no longer joked about the strange occurrences. He stopped playing music in the house entirely. Julia caught him once, in the middle of the night, standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring upward with a tense stillness that chilled her. When she asked what he was doing, he simply said, "She's up there." They began to feel a kind of pull toward the upstairs, even when they wanted to avoid it. Sometimes Julia would find herself halfway up the staircase without remembering deciding to go. At other times, she would wake in the early hours to find the bedroom light on, the door open wide, and the smell thick, sweet, and heavy spilling down the hallway. The last weekend before they were supposed to meet with a prospective buyer, a strange heaviness settled over the house. The air felt charged, almost humid, though the weather outside was dry and clear. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the shadows in the corners darker. And at night, the voice was no longer humming. It was singing, soft but distinct, each note deliberate, as if performing for someone sitting just a few feet away. Neither of them went upstairs that night. They sat together on the living room couch, the glow from the hallway spilling faintly into the room, listening to that voice drift down the staircase. It didn't stop until nearly dawn. They didn't speak about it the next day. But when Julia went to make coffee, she noticed the compact mirror still cracked, still faintly floral, sitting on the kitchen counter. She had left it upstairs. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. That week, the air inside the house began to feel different in a way Julia couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the scent anymore, though that perfume and cigarette mixture still lingered like an invisible curtain on the stairs. It was something heavier, a kind of pressure in the walls and floors, as though the house itself had begun to breathe. Julia started to hear faint shifts in the floorboards during the day, even when Mark was at work. She'd be in the kitchen washing dishes, sunlight spilling through the window, when she'd catch that familiar creak, slow, careful, measured, traveling from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other. Every time she went to look, the hall would be empty, the light pouring through the window at the far end, making the dust in the air shimmer. One afternoon, while reorganizing boxes in the living room, Julia noticed the compact mirror again, this time resting on the coffee table, directly in the center, as if it had been placed there deliberately. She still hadn't told Mark about it. The cracked reflection always made her uneasy. The face she'd glimpsed in it that first time had been too clear to dismiss as imagination. But now, when she opened the lid, the glass was spotless, perfectly clean, as though it had been replaced. Only the faintest scent of powder rose from it, sweet and old-fashioned. She snapped it shut and left it where it was. That night, the voice returned, but it wasn't humming or singing. It was speaking, low and soft, the words muffled, impossible to fully make out. Julia lay awake beside Mark, her eyes fixed on the dark doorway. The voice drifted closer, one soft footstep at a time, until it seemed to stop just outside their bedroom. She could hear the faint rhythm of breathing, steady and unhurried. Mark shifted beside her. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Julia didn't answer. The voice was clearer now, almost conversational, though the language felt slippery, like trying to hold onto a dream. One word caught her attention: stay. It came out in a breath, as if meant for her alone. The next morning, the bedroom door was open, though Julia was sure she'd closed it before going to sleep. And there, resting at the foot of the bed, was the compact mirror again. The days leading up to their planned meeting with the buyer felt stretched thin, as though time inside the house had slowed. Lights flickered faintly in the late afternoons, just enough for Julia to notice. Shadows moved in ways that didn't quite align with the sun's position. And there was always the voice, now not constant, but frequent enough that the silence in between felt charged, as if the house was waiting for them to answer. On the third night before the showing, Julia woke to find herself standing in the upstairs hallway, barefoot, wearing the same kaftan she'd found in one of the storage trunks left by the previous owner. She didn't remember putting it on. She didn't remember walking upstairs. At the far end of the hallway, near the window, she could make out the faint outline of a woman, a presence rather than a figure, her edges almost shimmering. The scent was overwhelming now, sweet, smoky, and warm. Julia's chest tightened as the woman tilted her head slightly, as though studying her. Then the voice came again, gentle, almost coaxing. "You look right in it." When Julia blinked, the figure was gone. The kaftan hung loose and heavy on her shoulders. Downstairs, she could hear music playing. Not from a device, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in the bones of the house. The following morning felt strangely muted, like the air had been drained of something essential. Outside, the sky was its usual pale California blue, but inside, the light seemed dimmer, as if filtered through a faint veil. Julia moved through the rooms quietly, every step echoing a little too much, each sound stretching longer than it should. Mark had left early for work, but Julia kept feeling as though someone else was there with her. Not in an immediate, alarming way, more like the sensation of being watched from a polite distance. The presence seemed content to linger, to follow her from room to room without rushing. It was in the creak of the stair when she descended, in the faint shift of air at her back when she stood at the kitchen counter. Around noon, she decided to take laundry upstairs. The bedroom door was already open, though she knew she had left it closed. The bed looked untouched, the sunlight falling in precise golden rectangles across the floor. But as she stepped inside, she noticed something that made her pause. The compact mirror sat neatly on the center of her pillow, open, the cracked glass reflecting the ceiling. For a long moment, she just stood there, watching the way the fractured reflection shifted with the faint movement of the curtain in the breeze. And then so quietly that she almost thought she imagined it, she heard a breath from within the room. Not hers, not Mark's. A slow, steady inhale, followed by a faint exhale that seemed to stir the air near her ear. She set the laundry basket down and backed out of the room. That night, Mark came home visibly unsettled. He'd brushed it off at first, but later, over dinner, he admitted he'd driven past the house 3 times before finally pulling into the driveway. "I don't know why," he said. "It just didn't feel like it wanted me here today." They didn't speak much after that. The silence between them wasn't born of anger or tension, it was something heavier, a shared understanding they weren't ready to put into words. In the early hours, Julia woke to the sound of music again. This time it was unmistakably coming from the upstairs bedroom, soft, rich vocals, the kind that filled the air without needing volume. She recognized the song, though she couldn't remember the title, only that it belonged to another era. Mark was still asleep beside her, breathing evenly, but his face twitched, like someone reacting to a sound in a dream. Julia slipped out of bed, each step on the stairs feeling like a decision she couldn't take back. The music grew clearer the closer she got, the voice smooth, warm, and impossibly close, as though the singer were standing just beyond the door. When she reached the bedroom, the music stopped. The room was dark except for the thin silver light spilling in from the window, and there propped against the headboard was the compact mirror, reflecting that pale moonlight in jagged pieces. The scent was almost suffocating now, saturating the air, making her head swim. Somewhere behind her, in the hallway, the floor creaked slowly, step by step, as though someone were walking away, yet the faintest whisper drifted toward her. so close it made the hairs on her neck stand on end. "Don't go." The next few days slid into a kind of slow, looping rhythm, as if time inside the house had taken on its own pace. Mornings felt hazy, afternoons unbearably still, and nights stretched on in a way Julia couldn't explain, each hour marked by small, almost imperceptible sounds, a faint knock from inside a wall, a whisper of movement along the upstairs landing, a door settling shut without a draft. It wasn't that she and Mark had stopped talking about the strange occurrences. It was that they'd stopped needing to. There was an unspoken agreement now, a silent acknowledgement that the house was not empty. They moved more carefully, their voices quieter, as if they were guests in someone else's home. One evening, Julia set out to make dinner but found herself drifting into the living room instead. The light from the setting sun painted the walls a deep amber, and for a moment she thought she saw the silhouette of a woman seated in the corner armchair, the one they'd never actually used. The shape was faint, like something seen through frosted glass, and when Julia blinked, it was gone. Still, she found herself setting the table for 3 that night. She didn't even realize it until Mark walked in, his eyes scanning the extra place setting. He didn't ask why it was, as if asking might invite something to answer. They both ate without touching the third plate, though Julia noticed the way her gaze kept drifting to it, half expecting to see the fork move. Later, when they were watching TV, the compact mirror appeared again, this time on the armrest beside Julia. She hadn't touched it since she'd seen it in the bedroom. Without thinking, she opened it, and in the fractured reflection she caught a glimpse of the room behind her. Only there was someone there. A woman standing in the doorway, head slightly tilted, her expression unreadable in the warped glass. When Julia turned, the doorway was empty. That night, Julia dreamed she was walking through the house, but it wasn't their house, not exactly. The walls were covered in patterned wallpaper she'd never seen. A record player spun in the corner, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke. She could hear laughter, clinking glasses, the sound of a voice, smooth, deep, familiar, singing from somewhere just out of sight. She woke with the kaftan folded neatly at the foot of the bed. She hadn't touched it since the night she'd found herself wearing it. Mark began to change in small ways. He lingered upstairs more often, even when he didn't need to be there. He'd pause in doorways as if listening to something Julia couldn't hear. Once, when she called his name, he turned to her slowly, like someone waking from a daydream, and said, "I think she likes us." His voice was calm, almost content. Julia didn't answer, but she noticed that the house was warmer than usual. A slow, constant heat that didn't come from the weather or the vents. It felt like breath, like the closeness of someone sitting just behind her shoulder. On the morning of their scheduled showing, Julia woke to find the bedroom curtains drawn shut, the door closed, and the compact mirror resting on her chest. Inside, the cracked reflection didn't show her face at all. It showed the upstairs hallway empty, still, and waiting. She didn't tell Mark, and when the realtor called to confirm their appointment, Julia found herself saying, almost without thinking, "We're not ready yet." The days after Julia canceled the showing seemed to melt together into one long, unbroken stretch of time. Morning light no longer felt bright inside the house. It seeped in weakly, dimmed as though it had to pass through layers of something heavy before reaching the rooms. Outside, the world still moved on. Cars passing on Laurel Canyon Boulevard, neighbors walking their dogs. But inside, the air carried the quiet hum of a place that was no longer just walls and wood, but something aware. Julia and Mark stopped discussing selling altogether. It wasn't an agreement, not even a decision, they simply stopped. The thought of leaving felt less and less urgent, as though it were being gently, steadily pulled out of them. Instead, they began to take comfort in the strange routine the house seemed to impose. Dinner at the same time each night. Lights dimmed to a warm glow after sunset. The kaftan draped over the bedroom chair, untouched but always clean and pressed. The voice was constant now, but never intrusive. It drifted through the house like background music, sometimes humming, sometimes singing, sometimes speaking in half-formed sentences that dissolved before they could be understood. Julia caught herself answering once, in the kitchen, without even realizing she'd spoken aloud. One evening, while Mark was in the shower, Julia wandered upstairs and found the bedroom bathed in golden lamplight, though neither of them had turned a lamp on. On the bed sat the compact mirror, open, the cracked reflection catching her from the corner of its fractured glass. Only it wasn't her as she was. The woman in the mirror had heavier lashes, fuller lips, a softness around the eyes that felt older, warmer, entirely different. The reflection's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Julia felt no fear. She sat down on the bed and stayed there for what might have been minutes, might have been hours, until Mark appeared in the doorway, his hair damp, his expression unreadable. "You're beautiful like that," he said quietly. Neither of them questioned what "like that" meant. In the weeks that followed, small pieces of their old life slipped away without discussion. Julia's work calls went unanswered. Mark stopped returning messages from his office. Friends who tried to visit never made it past the locked front gate. Mark insisted the buzzer must be broken, though Julia suspected the truth was simpler. The house didn't want them there. Then one morning, Julia woke to find the caftan laid across her, soft and weighty, as if it had been placed there by careful hands. She rose without thinking, put it on, and walked to the upstairs window. Outside, the city sprawled in the pale light of dawn, but it felt distant, irrelevant, as if she were looking out from another time entirely. Behind her, she heard the faint shuffle of bare feet on the carpet, the gentle intake of breath before a song begins. She turned. The woman was there. Not a shadow, not a reflection, full, solid, standing in the bedroom with her. A figure draped in flowing fabric, hair loose, eyes fixed on Julia with a warmth that was almost maternal. The scent was overwhelming now, sweet, smoky, alive. "Stay," the woman said. It wasn't a request. From downstairs came the sound of Mark's voice, speaking in a low, steady tone, as though answering someone she couldn't see. Julia glanced toward the door, but when she looked back, the woman was closer, the air around her shimmering faintly. The house seemed to inhale, and Julia understood clearer than she had understood anything that they weren't leaving. Not today. Not ever. When the realtor called again the following week, no one answered. The number eventually disconnected. The house stood quiet from the street, its stucco walls warm in the sun, the red clay tiles catching the light. But inside, the air was thick with perfume and music, and somewhere in the upstairs bedroom, a mirror reflected not one life, but two. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.